In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the philosophy of Augustine. But before we do, I thought it would be helpful for us to do just a quick recap of where we've been so far. So we began the semester with a group of philosophers known as the pre-Socratic philosophers who had various debates, metaphysical debates, where they were moving away from mythology, moving away from the religious tradition. Now again, that's not to say that they weren't religious people, but that when it came to the big metaphysical discussions and debates, they were trying to use the tools of reason and not the tools of mythology. So there are various debates going back and forth. The sophists come along and they're observing these debates, and they come to the conclusion that since nobody can convince anyone else, therefore there must be no truth. And Socrates comes along in response to the sophists and simply asks them, is that true? In other words, to state that there is no truth is to state a truth that is self-contradictory, which led to two huge schools of thought that have been influential in the West ever since then. That is Platonism, which comes from the philosopher Plato, who argued for a rational, dualistic approach to knowledge. So we might consider Plato to be the first one to introduce rationalism into the philosophical discussion, which is to say that the way that we know things is through the use of reason, speculation, and we use our reason to access the realm of the forms. And his dualism is where he divides the world into the realm of the forms and the realm of the particulars. The forms is this conceptual, immaterial world, and the particulars is the physical world that we observe around us. The student that comes after Plato is Aristotle, and Aristotle learns a lot from Plato, but moves away from some of Plato's perspectives by arguing that the forms do exist, but the forms don't exist as an immaterial entity that exists outside of the natural world. Rather, the forms are immanent in nature. That means they exist in the physical world that we see around us. And because of that, the way that we learn about the world is through observation and logical deduction. Aristotle is the first person to formalize logic in Western thought. And then you have the philosophers after Aristotle, which we looked at in our previous lecture, the Epicurean philosophers, the Stoic philosophers, the skeptics, and the Neoplatonists. So we turn now to Augustine. And as we talk about Augustine, I think it's important for us to talk about just the influence of Christianity at this point. So Augustine is a Christian theologian and philosopher. And the philosopher Bertrand Russell, in his history of philosophy, writes that philosophy, as distinct from theology, so there's two disciplines here, philosophy and theology. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. Theology is the study of God. So philosophy, as distinct from theology, began in Greece in the 6th century BC. But after running its course in antiquity, it was again submerged by theology as Christianity rose and Rome fell. And for Bertrand Russell, this was a bad thing. Russell was a famous atheist philosopher in the 20th century, and he argued that this introduced, really set philosophy back by several hundred years when Christianity rose. But we will turn our attention now to what the influence of Christianity did to philosophy. And to start, we need to remember, again, what Plato was arguing, because a lot of early Christian philosophy sprung out of Plato's philosophy. And then when you get later to Thomas Aquinas, which we'll talk about him later in the semester, Thomas Aquinas goes back to Aristotle, but early Christian philosophy really comes out of Plato. So Plato, again, wants to access the realm of the forms through rational thinking. And Plato's a dualist, so our thoughts are the immaterial parts of us, and our bodies are the material parts of us. That's where our five senses are. So we use our five senses to access the physical world, but we use our thoughts to access the realm of the forms. Well, this brings up a big question. How can an impersonal fact or object or form be translated into language or into a thought? This is a big, important philosophical question that Augustine wants to tackle. And Augustine tackles this philosophy by bringing in his Christian convictions. So Augustine's not ashamed of theology. In fact, Augustine will argue that theology is foundational for philosophy. And specifically, what is foundational is this notion of creation. So creation in Christian theology isn't an impersonal fact. The natural world around us is not an impersonal fact. Rather, creation is the Word, the Logos of God. And so we've already heard this concept, Logos, now with the Stoic philosophers and with other early philosophers. Well, in Christian theology, the Logos is the speech of God. And so we use our mind, which when we think, we're thinking in language, we're thinking in words. And so the Christian philosophers would say that we use our language thoughts to access the mind of God. And so this is kind of like Plotinus. So we're not talking about an impersonal realm of the forms anymore. Now we're talking about the mind of God. But we use our physical senses to access the speech of God all around us. So what we're observing around us is not a material world. Rather, it's a world of language. The chair that you're sitting in right now is the speech of God. And this is part of the influence of Christian theology. Now we see this theology represented in the New Testament. Paul of Tarsus is one of the main characters in the Christian New Testament who is responsible for the spread of Christianity. And in the book of Acts, we see a conversation that he had with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And in this account, Paul says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For I passed along and I saw an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by human hands." In other words, this God is outside the physical world, the God who made everything in the physical world. For, Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being. And Paul is actually quoting some of the Greek poets at this point, giving his conception of what God is like. And Augustine takes these ideas and comes up with a comprehensive a philosophy that really follows the tradition that was set by the Greek philosophers. But one of the things that Augustine does in doing this is he promotes a way of doing philosophy that has been known as faith-seeking understanding. So in our last lecture, we looked at one of the problems of skepticism. And the problem of skepticism is since there are all these disagreements among the philosophers about what true reality is, can we ever say that we can know anything at all? And the skeptics say, no, just face the fact we can't know anything at all, except for the fact that I'm thinking right now. That's maybe the only thing that I can know. But anything about the world out there, I don't think I have any access to that. Well, Augustine takes skepticism seriously, but says what the skeptics showed is that you need to start with faith. He argued that all of knowledge begins with faith commitments, and when you start with the right faith commitments, then you go along and you seek understanding. And so his statement is, seek not to understand so that you might believe, but rather Believe first so that you may understand. And so for Augustine argues that the conception of reality that we need to start with, and he acknowledges this is a faith conception. He's not saying that there's any proof that this conception of reality is right. He's saying this is the starting point of reasoning, and he thinks that this gives rise to further philosophical thought and development. But he begins with the notion of God. So God is a rational thinking moral agent. And this God creates a physical world. So creation all around us is the speech of God for Augustine, based off of the Hebrew Bible and off of the Christian New Testament. But what this means is that prime reality, basic reality, is not Plato's realm of the forms, but it's kind of like Plotinus's idea of the one. A mental reality, God as a rational thinking moral agent, is prime reality. And this God creates an orderly universe, but this God also creates humans in the image of God, the imago Dei. And what this says for Augustine is that human thoughts are free, and those thoughts are analogous to God's thoughts. And so right now Augustine is dividing the world into a necessary world where God exists and a contingent world where created things exist. Created things like you and me and the observable world around us. And this develops into a way of knowing the world. So if it's the case that God's thoughts bring about an orderly universe, then what that means is that God's thoughts, God's speech, prescribe an orderly universe. So the reason why the universe can be studied for Augustine is because the universe is the speech, the rational speech of God. So when God thinks about the universe, God's thoughts are actually causing the universe to be what it is. But now, in an analogous way, when I think about the universe, or when you think about the universe, our thoughts are describing this orderly universe. And so this is how there is a bridge between my perception of reality and the way that the world is, because the same God that created the physical cosmos, the created world, is the same God that I'm created in the image of. And that's why there's a correspondence between the two. And that's really what Augustine's faith-seeking understanding is all about. Now, this brings up many questions. If God is the one who creates the physical cosmos in the way that we know everything around us, well, how does this work when it comes to ethics? Well, Augustine says that moral truths are just built into the fabric of creation. That's how we can have moral perceptions inside of us, but we can also say that our moral perceptions correspond to the way that the world actually is, because the world is functioning according to God's moral designs. But Augustine then has to deal with a huge question that came before him in the works of Plato, Plato's famous Euthyphro dilemma. So in the Euthyphro dilemma, you have this question, which we talked about in a previous lecture. Is something good because the gods say that it's good? Or do the gods say that something is good because it is good? And the question is there this good moral standard that is above God that God is living according to? Well, if that's the case, then God is not the highest, most virtuous thing, but the standard of goodness is the highest, most virtuous thing, and God is submitting to that. But if you reverse it, then in the Euthyphro dilemma, that implies that God is just arbitrarily deciding what's right and wrong. So God can decide that racism is a good thing one moment, but then that racism is bad the next moment, and that just makes moral values completely arbitrary, and why would we ever follow them? Well, Augustine responds to this dilemma by saying that goodness is not an impersonal form or concept. Rather, what goodness is a personal agent. In other words, what Augustine is saying is that goodness is God. There's no distinction between the two. God is the standard for goodness. So whatever you were to think that goodness is, goodness can't even exist, according to Augustine, apart from a personal agent. Because when you say that something is good or bad, what you're doing is you're making a judgment. And to make a judgment requires that you're a personal agent saying this is good, this is bad. And what Augustine is saying is to have any standard of goodness at all, you have to have a personal agent that's making those determinations. Because goodness can't just float out there without some personal agent. So the standard itself is God, and therefore the created world around us is flowing out of God's perfection. And so this gives him a theological understanding of ethics. His ethics centers on God in his famous statement where Augustine says, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds rest in thee." And so what goodness is finding rest in God. And this is similar to Plotinus again, who's saying that God is the substance of reality and everything is an emanation from it. Well, Augustine is saying sort of the same thing. To live a good moral life is to find your rest in the substance of goodness, and that is God. And this leads into what has become known as the Privation Theory of Goodness, which is simply to say that evil is just moving away from goodness. And what is goodness? Goodness is God. So evil is not a thing that exists apart from God. Rather, evil happens when you move away from God. And that wraps up Augustine's understanding of morality and ethics. It helps you understand what ethics is. And he explains this understanding by going back to the Hebrew scriptures, and he gives an interpretation of the Garden of Eden that represents this privation theory of evil. So what we call evil is nothing but the absence of good, according to Augustine. And this can be seen in the Garden of Eden story. So if you remember the Garden of Eden story, this is the story where Christians get the doctrine of original sin. So you have this story where Adam and Eve are put in a garden, and God comes to them and says, you may eat from any tree of the Garden of Eden, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, Augustine, reflecting on the story, asked the question, what does it mean to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And Augustine suggests that the tree that we're not supposed to eat from is not a physical tree that exists in the Garden of Eden. Rather, the tree is to eat from any tree in such a way that you prefer the creation over the Creator. And this is where original sin comes from. When we prefer something in the natural world over God. Because God is the substance of good, and to prefer anything else over good is to actually commit a sinful, evil act. And because of this, and everyone does this, we could never achieve a just society on our own merits. Our fundamental sin is something that all of us do, according to Augustine, is we prefer creation over the Creator. And he says the problem with the Greek philosophers is that they have wished with amazing folly to be happy here on earth and to achieve bliss by their own efforts. But that is the very thing that makes us bad, according to Augustine, is that we think that happiness is found here on earth when happiness is found by worshiping and resting in God. And so he writes a very famous work that has become very influential throughout the history of the West, and we'll see themes from this work coming up specifically in John Locke and later philosophers, but it's his work called The City of God. And the City of God, for Augustine, is what society looks like when everyone rests in God and submits to Jesus as king. And the city of man is the contrast of the city of God. It's simply the best that we can do in this life. So again, Augustine recognizes that everyone's preferring creation over the Creator, and so the best that we can do in this life is what we find in the city of man, what we find in societies around us today. It's not the ideal, but it's the best that we can do. And because we're sinful, Augustine has a low view of politics. He thinks that politics, by necessity, is focusing only on the city of man. And if we're focusing just on making the city of man better, we're not focusing on God. And so if we're going to have a government, now he does think that we need to have a government. We do need to have a view of politics, but we shouldn't make it the focus. And his low view of politics leads him to a purpose for what government is there for, and that purpose is to do nothing but to restrain evil. There's no other purpose for government, where in Greek thought, many of the Greek philosophers, such as Plato, thought that the purpose of government is to shepherd human societies in virtue, to live a good, virtuous, just life, to create a just society. Augustine says we can't do that because we're sinful. But what we can do is create a government that has one task, and that is to restrain evil. Now, the reason why I say that this idea is influential is because after Augustine, when we get to John Locke, John Locke takes up a similar idea, but he says that the purpose of government is not to restrain evil, but rather to protect freedom, to protect life, liberty, and property. So it's a minimal, small purpose for government, and you can see this small understanding of government being traced back to thinkers like Augustine.